It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Ron Howard of Stanford University. Ron has been instrumental over his career in the development of decision analysis. I'll be interviewing him for the next hour. My name is Tom Keelin. I'm a former student of Professor Howard's and a longtime friend and professional colleague. Ron, would you please describe your family background, where you grew up, family, siblings, parents' work, education?
Yeah, that's quite a story because both my grandparents worked on the Titanic. Both my paternal grandfather and my maternal grandfather worked at Harland Wolff shipyards in Belfast where the Titanic was built. And that was part of Northern Ireland, of course, as it still is. And then my mother and father met in Northern Ireland and became engaged. And my father decided to come to the U.S. as an immigrant, which he did in 1926. And then my mother came over in 1927. And she stayed at the minister's house and they were married the next day. So I'm a first-generation American.
Boy, that's very interesting. You once told me, Ron, that you spent lots of time in the library when you were growing up. How and why so?
Well, during the Second World War, we lived in what in New York is called a candy store, which is something that's a unique New York institution. It had a soda fountain, it had magazines and candy and greeting cards and tobacco products and so forth. And we lived in, housing was tight, we lived in one room behind this store from about 40 to 45. And that was a great experience because right across the street from the room we lived in was the library of the town. And I found that you could check out half a dozen books for a week at absolutely no charge. It's like 50 feet from where we got out of the store. So that was a great experience. And I did that. As a matter of fact, my mother signed slips that Ronald's not feeling well right up to the point of truancy because I was learning a lot more from these books on everything from opera librettos to the boy electrician than I was learning in the store. And I had one other advantage, and that is we had all the magazines of the time, Life, Saturday Evening Post, all the newspapers, because people would stop there to pick them up. And so I could read any magazine, Popular Science, whatever it was, in any newspaper, as much as I wanted, of course, without harming it in any way. And quite a wonderful education. And I went to the very exquisitely named PS 138. Talk about Queens, New York, which is talk about running out of imagination and naming schools. Well, PS 138 certainly did it.
Was that your high school, Ron?
That was my grade school.
That was your grade school?
I went there from until the 5th grade. Then my mother took me back to Northern Ireland to see her mother, although her mother had died. And so I spent, instead of the 6th grade there, at the house of my grandfather, and my mother had the public, the local school teacher tutor me a couple of times a week. So I ended up learning algebra during the 6th grade, which is a great advantage. And I learned things working with him that I never would have learned until high school when I came back. So that was the 6th grade. Then we came back, and at that time the war was over, and housing was very difficult. And so we ended up living in a hotel room for a year, and the hotel room with the bath facilities down the hall. So we had a sink in where we slept. That was the year 1947 in Rockville Center, New York. And that was a great experience because essentially I went to a public school there with a couple of certainly the best teacher I ever had at that level in the 7th grade. College students would come back to say hello to her. And so I knew that I was in the presence of somebody who was really dedicated to education. So she taught me English and math, and that was to this day, it was great to think of all she must have affected in my education.
So following that, obviously you went to high school, college, graduate school.
Yeah,
What
actually, there's one other
subjects?
thing.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. By accident, I never went to the 8th grade because when I graduated in the 7th grade in Rockwell Center, it said promoted to high school. And high school started in the 8th grade in Rockwell Center, but in the high school I went to in Lynbrook, high school started in the 9th grade. So neither my mother or I corrected this misimpression, so I went into the 9th grade in Lynbrook High School. So in fact, there's a big gap in my education, like House of Cards. Maybe they'll find out, hey, never really went to the 8th grade. So that was Lynbrook High School, where I went for 4 years, and had a great time. 4 of us went to MIT. There's a high school of about 120 in the graduating class, and 4 of us went to MIT, which is quite a fraction, and all of us graduated.
In your high school, college, and even graduate years, what subjects did you find most interesting and engaging?
Well, that's a long story, because I started out in electrical engineering, which I liked very much, but then I wanted to do something more broad than that, and so I got another bachelor's degree in economics. Had a bachelor's degree in electrical and a bachelor's in economics, and that was possible because at MIT they had something called an advanced standing exam, and what that meant was if you could get the professor to agree by petition, then by spending $5, you could take the final exam he would prepare, and if you passed that, then you got credit for the course. So this was a very inexpensive way of getting academic credit. It allowed me to finish in 4 years, though I was working every summer.
During these school years, what people, ideas, or events most influenced your thinking and your ultimate career interests?
Well, one of the people that made a big difference in my life was the teacher of science in the high school, Mr. Carr. He taught physics and chemistry, and we got along very well, and he would give me the run of the science laboratory after school was over, unsupervised, something you'd never see today. So I could have made, I had nitric acid and toluene, I could have made TNT. I did make, fermented alcohol and made hydrogen and flew the balloons and all that. I had the whole lab to myself. Of course, I never did anything that would cause him a problem, but what a wonderful thing. And I said, wouldn't it be great if any student had this opportunity to have a whole science and physics lab to themselves while they're a senior in high school?
Any particularly inspirational professors in college at MIT?
Well, more in grad, there were a couple that I liked, but I had some very broad-ranging professors. I remember taking a course in probability in connection with the economics course, and I'd learned a lot of probability already. And so I made a deal. This was Robert Solow, who later got the Nobel Prize in economics. And I said, look, and I'm enjoying taking your course, but I've taken other courses, and so that your problem sets are not really a challenge. How about I make up and solve my own problems? And he said, that'd be great. Of course, he could use them for any purpose after that. And I've been waiting my whole academic career for some student to make me that offer, but it hasn't happened yet.
Ron, what was the focus of your PhD dissertation, and what led you to pick this topic?
Yes, well, there was one incident when I was at MIT that made a big impression on me. I went in the physics department. I just happened to drop in on this talk given by a fellow called Stanislaus Ulam. Seemed like he's a physicist, and I learned that he had worked in the Manhattan Project on the atomic bomb. And what he talked about was something called Markov processes, which sounded like something I never heard about before and was pretty interesting. And so that piqued my interest in it, and that became a focus on most of the graduate research that I did, including in my final thesis with big impact and completely random, as far as I know.
When did it become clear to you that you wished to pursue an academic career, and were there particular people or ideas that inspired you in this direction?
Academic, yeah, that's kind of interesting because when I was a graduate student, I just did it a year at a time. I wasn't thinking of what I was going to do. I just enjoyed what I was doing. So I got these 2 bachelor's degrees. Then I went another year, but by this time I was married and had a child. And so in one more year I got a master's degree in electrical engineering. Then I found by spending another year I could get something called the electrical engineer degree, which was another year of study. And so I did that, and then I found you could also get this thing called a doctorate, which never appeared in my thinking before. But that sounded like a good idea, so I signed up for that and got my doctorate. And so those were the 3 years that I spent in graduate school. I was on a fellowship, but I had a wife to support and a child. So I got permission to work in spite of having this fellowship and a stipend. And so I ended up working 2 days a week all the way through graduate school for those 3 years. And where I worked was the operations research group of Arthur D. Little, which was the outstanding operations research group doing commercial work at that time. And at Arthur D. Little was George Kimball, who, with Philip Morse at MIT, had written the book Methods of Operations Research about their experiences during World War II in using operations research methods. And so George had been professor of chemical physics at Columbia, and he then moved into the industrial world. He was kind of the senior VP of science stuff at Arthur D. Little, and Philip Morse was a professor, particularly in the acoustics area at MIT. So they were the 2 people that I spent most time with on research, and they had very complementary styles. Phil Morse, his way of approaching it was you'd write all these equations to describe the thing, and they might look hard to solve, but boy, he would beat his way through until he solved them. George Kimball came at things the other way. He'd find that the simplest representation of something, so simple you might say, this doesn't make any sense, and all of a sudden you say, of course, this is the key to the whole thing. So they were a great combination.
So somehow did that inspire you to move toward an academic career as opposed to a commercial, let's say, continued consulting career with Arthur D. Little?
Well, I was enjoying working at Arthur D. Little, and actually, I got an opportunity to be an assistant professor at MIT, but that was not surprising because they would hire many times as many people, maybe 6 or 7, as they had place for, at least in those days. And so the idea was, well, if you didn't continue in an academic career, then you'd get a very good job someplace else if you were, say, at Harvard or MIT. So that's what I was doing. And I was also working at a consulting company. And this was as well, after Arthur D. Little, I also had other consulting opportunities. And this one was it was called United Research, and previously, when I was a doctoral student, I remember having a conversation with my fellow doctoral students about, well, how much money would we have to make to feel, really comfortable? You imagine it today. Anybody, what? I won't have to worry about money. I'm going to get a house. I get everything I need. How much would that be? And you pick a number today, but that was, of course, a lot more than I was making as a professor. So one day the president of this company called me in and he said, we'd like to offer you a job as director of research and he named exactly that kind of number. And I said, well, gee, I have to think about it. They said, okay, let me know on Monday. This was Friday afternoon. So that afternoon I went back to the first floor of a 2-family house where we lived for $89 a month, having 2 children and an old car. And I said, we this was a great opportunity. And of course, there were no promises at MIT. I mean, I might have been not ever been reappointed. So that was the weekend when I said, look, what do I really want to do with my life? Am I really enjoying this? Is this me? And by Monday, I said, yeah, that's what I'm doing. I don't know how it's going to work out, but this is what I want to do. So that's when I chose an academic career, without knowing I'd ever really get it, but I was there.
When and why did you end up choosing to move from the East Coast to Stanford?
Oh yeah, that's another great story. Well, I had met Bill Linville, who was a professor in the in the electrical engineering department at MIT, this was when I had just finished my bachelor's degree. And that's a long story, but by accident I got to know him. He was a consultant for the summer at Raytheon Research Labs, and I had just graduated with my bachelor's degree. And so we spent a lot of time together in an environment that was unusual for both of us. And he is the one who said, you ought to be seeing these people at Arthur D. Little and getting a job there. So he was responsible for all of that, and of course for recommending me for these fellowships and things that took me through graduate school. So it had a major influence on my career. Well, once I graduated and decided to stay at MIT and continued into operations research I became associate director of the Operations Research Center at MIT with Phil Morse, and we traveled around the world, all kinds of things. But I kept in touch with Bill. Bill had left MIT for Stanford, but we were still, professional colleagues. So in I guess it was late '63, he said, how would you like to come out for a sabbatical year at Stanford, which I was due for from MIT anyway. And he said, no, you can just come out for the year and finish writing your book on dynamic programming and markup processes. You'll enjoy it. Bring a family. So my wife, 4 kids and a dog, left our split level in Lexington, Mass, and went out to Palo Alto and spent the year there, thinking it'd be a great fun year here in California. And then by the end of that year, I had started into something called decision analysis, and also I had liked what I was doing at Stanford and decided when I had the offer to come to Stanford as a professor. So that's when I became a professor at Stanford full-time in 1955, 56.
55 or 50?
Well, I'm sorry, 65.
65, yes.
Sorry, 65 to 66.
Yeah.
First year. So that's been a long time ago, right? Many, many years.
Well, almost 50 years ago.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Your doctoral work, Ron, and your first 2 books focused on Markov decision processes.
That's exactly right.
And especially on the intersection of decision-making under uncertainty and optimization.
Correct.
Your later works and teaching tended to emphasize decision-making under uncertainty and the principles underlying that, and put much less emphasis on optimization. Why so?
Well, actually, it's a matter of what kind of data did we have at the time to support the dynamic programming and markup processing. That was one issue. There were very few situations where you had what you needed to get transition probabilities and so forth. We found one at Sears Roebuck that really worked out as a great application, and it really improved their profits, but it made a lot of sense. But that was most unusual. Now today, Safeway knows more about my grocery shopping habits than I do. And so that data is out there for anybody. So actually what I worked on then is much more applicable now than it was then. But what I got interested in was working on what made people lay awake at night thinking about making a decision. And that wasn't those things. Those were operational decisions. And so that's why I said, okay, that's what I want to do. Work on those problems. They're really hard for people to think their way through, no matter in what area they are, medicine, business. And that's the focus that I've had ever since.
So in 1964, while at Stanford, it is said that you coined the term decision analysis.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about how that happened and what led you to this particular choice of terminology.
Well, that's a relatively simple story because when I was out for that sabbatical year, writing my book, I also had as a contact a fellow called Sherm Neymark, who had been in a course I gave called the Modern Engineering course under GE, the 6-week residential course. And in that course I had taught statistical decision theory, markup processes, and things like this. And when Sherm, who was the head of GE Nuclear in San Jose, knew I was coming out for the year, he said, look, why don't you teach what you were teaching us in that course to my people here in GE Nuclear. So that, I said, fine, and so we spent, I spent a couple of hours every Monday going down and teaching this course. Well, after about the 3rd week, somebody came up and said, well, you know, this is all very interesting, decision theory and balls and urns and so forth. But, you know, we have this big decision to make. Should we put a superheater on our power reactor? And, you know, that we're really concerned about that. His name was Howard Cook. He was a thermal engineer. I said, well, why not? You know, so through the course of that year, we applied this way of thinking to this very real decision problem they had involving the material lifetime involved in this change. That if it came out too short a life, it would be a very bad thing to have done. A long life would be fine. So it was uncertain how long the life would be, and we encoded probabilities and so on. Well, it turned out in the analysis that the length of life of that material really was not important in making the decision, because they could engineer in a different way, I won't get into the details, to isolate themselves from that. And what turned out to be the real issue was their time preference. How long were they willing to wait for a return on this very large investment? And they hadn't even thought about that before. So the decision was made not to proceed on the basis of this analysis. Well, so at the end of that academic year, there was a conference in Boston. I think it was an ORSA conference, where I think Howard Rafer was chairing the session, and I gave a talk in it. I wrote up called, describing this work. What am I going to call it? And I thought initially decision engineering, because that's really what it was. But that had a flavor of maybe I'm going to try to make it come out a certain way. So I said, okay, analysis doesn't have that, so decision analysis. And the paper was entitled Decision Analysis: Applied Statistical Decision Theory.
Did you have any particular collaboration with Howard Rafer in this regard?
He had, when I was at Arthur D. Little, as far as I remember, he had given a talk there, and I believe that's the first time I actually met him. And then as soon as I graduated, like 1959, 60, he asked me to teach in a program he was having at Harvard Business School called the Institute of Basic Mathematics for Application in Business. And that was a very interesting program where I think it was the Ford Foundation sponsored business school professors from all over the country. They had to be recommended by their deans and so forth to get more mathematics into business teaching. And it was a residential program that came out with their families for a year. So Howard directed this and started it. And then there were a couple of other professors who respectively taught optimization and probability. And I did markup processes and computation on like 1 day a week. I wasn't there full time. And that was great because several of those people became deans of the famous business schools in the future. And it was a great opportunity to meet such people.
In retrospect, how happy are you with the choice of terminology, decision analysis?
I think it would be hard to change it in a way that improved it. In other words, decision engineering is more accurate but easily misunderstood. And so I like the idea that what we're going to do is think about all the factors that influence a decision, put it together with very clear thinking and about what we want and what the alternatives are and how ignorant or informed we are, and arrive at the best choice we possibly could, given the limitations of our knowledge and the existence of our preferences and the best alternatives we've been able to think of for what to do here.
As your teaching assistant in decision analysis classes at Stanford in the early 70s, I recall you're telling us students that decision analysis is a new profession. What led you to believe that it would become so at the time?
Well, the early 70s would have been 5 or 6 or 7 years into what we had seen going on at SRI International in our decision analysis group. And it was pretty clear that this was a very new and helpful way to help people make decisions that were really bothering them. I mean, not little decisions, but really big decisions. I mean, some of our projects were for Mexico, whether they should have a nuclear reactor, a power reactor in their electrical system, the launching of the Voyager space mission, marine fisheries, all kinds of issues that came up. So it didn't seem like as if there was any a limitation to where you could apply it, just the limitation of people wanting to think this way. And I think that is still true, that we have just scratched the surface in terms of improving the quality of decisions that people are making in the world. So it is a new profession, but it's not one that it's one it takes a while to learn in terms of the theoretical basis, and then that's not sufficient. You have to know how to actually carry out in practice all the conversations that you need to show people how to get the vague things in their head into a form where we can all look at them and agree on what we're talking about. So that clarity of representation is the key, clarity of thought in terms of being able to think straight about complicated situations, and then finally achieving clarity of action, which is what are you going to do now that you're thinking straight.
And I guess at that time in the 70s, you already had the experience under your belt of many years of consulting both at, Arthur D. Little and then SRI International.
Oh, yeah, well,
you had seen the value in practice.
Oh, yeah, well, I remember when I was a graduate student writing on with George Kimball and another fellow who was a senior consultant at the Arthur D. Little Operations Research Group on the overnight train to Detroit, where we went to, which was great. You don't see this kind of travel. We get on the train in Boston, and you wake up in the morning, very close to your client, across the street to Michigan Bell, which was the client, and around the boardroom, and you're working. Here I am, like a 22, 23-year-old person with these very experienced people, and with this company had a real problem. It was a very, very challenging mathematical problem that we were able to represent and solve for them using the newfangled computers. Okay, the computers that if they didn't have punch cards, they had punch paper tape in which you put in the instructions. So the computation was relatively primitive, compared to anything we have today, but it still could make a big difference in what they were doing in terms of making the decisions in their operating decisions and also more strategic ones in their business.
Ron, in the early 1980s, you experienced what you later described as going crazy.
It's actually 77.
Was it 77?
1977.
And it was for a several-week period, and your medical diagnoses while in the hospital confirmed this. What led up to this event?
Well, of course, their view of it and my view of it was very different. And it was really a weekend. We're talking about from Friday till the next Tuesday or something. And what my experience was that I was waking up and becoming sane. But to other people, becoming sane seemed very strange. So I ended up being, it takes about 6 hours to tell the whole story, but it's the best thing that ever happened to me in terms of changing my life. So I went from, I'll tell just a little bit of it. I was locked up in the mental ward at the Santa Clara Hospital. People were thinking I was intending to hurt myself. No, I wasn't. But so there I am, sitting tied down to a hospital bed that night. And they keep trying to put pills in my mouth, which I kept spitting out. And finally, they just injected me against my will with, it turned out to be Thorazine. And there were notices all over this place about, no patient will be forced to blind. They just broke the law. I mean, this was not surprising to me, but kind of shocking that they would do such a thing. And I said, it takes a long time to tell us, and we don't have the time today. But anyway, that's when I realized that this was not an educational institution. And the next morning, when I woke up, I'll just mention a couple of things. One was I wanted to take a shower. And so the attendant says, okay, here's the showers, and I'll get you some soap. And so he came back with a little paper cup of soap, red, liquid soap. And he said, don't drink the soap. And I said, why would I drink the soap? He says, I don't know, but somebody drank it last week, so what did I tell you? So I'm thinking, drink the soap. So I smell the soap. It smells like cherries. As a matter of fact, a lot of our soap smells like fruit, doesn't it? Why? Why do you want something that washes you? See, so you saw everything in a completely new way, and we wonder why kids, go under the sink and start drinking stuff. Well, we've made it smell like lemons and cherry. That's really crazy. What's crazy is not somebody drinking the soap; it's making soap that smells like food. Anyway, about an hour later, I won't get into, we don't have the time to get into the details, but finally I was going to be interviewed by the psychiatrist. And so he came in, very young man, and he says, oh, I see you teach at Stanford. So it's, he's starting a conversation. So I say, yes. And he says, well, do you know, by the way, what do you teach? I said, well, I'm teaching this Inter-Economic Systems Department. He says, oh, do you know Allen Ginsberg, right? I said, oh, yeah, he was one of my doctoral students, right? He's now at Columbia. He said, oh, he's a good friend of mine. So we're having this perfectly good conversation, right? And then he remembers, hey, this is a nut I'm supposed to be interviewing. But you see, it was mundane. And yet, I shouldn't have been there.
I understand.
Right? And then when my wife came to visit me in the afternoon, she says, I was telling her this story, what happened to me, and she says, well, no, they said they didn't inject you, right? And I said, well, look at this hole in my arm, and they don't give us anything sharp in here. I mean, it's a great story, but it takes a long time to tell.
So,
anyway, it was a great thing ever happened to me. I woke up, my students are very concerned, but I would have paid tens of thousands of dollars for that experience, because you couldn't go in as a reporter and get that experience.
You said you were waking up. What were you waking up to?
Oh, what I was waking up to, all the things that I had believed that were not right. Okay? I mean, in other words, I hadn't thought about the whole environment, which is related to what we're talking about, the whole environment in which we make decisions. Because you could be a great decision analyst, but decision analysis has no moral content in it. It's amoral. It's a powerful tool. You could use it to figure out how to assassinate somebody or how to annihilate a whole group of people. So, it's like an adding machine. You can add up victims or you can add up the people you save. So whatever ethical content it's going to have, like fire or knives, has to come from the person using them. And so that was the waking up to how it affected my teaching and in general my whole attitude toward life. So that's when I resolved to get into to ethics, what the question of what's a proper thing to do, not what can you do, but what's the right kind of thing to do, and then as a derivative of that, what part of your personal ethical code are you willing to impose on other people by force, which has to do with the whole legal system, the draft, all kinds of things that are present in our life today as we speak. People killing each other around the world now, not because they're different kinds of people. They're all human beings, and I know that because we see people all over the world in our doctoral program. You get to know them very well. If there's bad people out there, I haven't met them yet. And yet, all kinds of people do very bad things.
As I recall, this also spawned an investigation on your part into multiple world religions.
Oh, yeah. But you see, one of the things when I went through this was, well, surely this must have happened to other people. I'm not unique here. And so when you start looking for it, you find lots of experiences of people who have had this transforming event in their lives. And we know that, look at Christianity, where St. Paul, was a big persecutor of Christians, and then one day on the road to Damascus, God spoke to him, and then he became one of the people who wrote many of the books in the Bible. So, and that's happened to all kinds of people religiously, and it's transforming. And when I went to say, well, how, really, what, where is this a normal thing? And when I remember reading about Indian religions, and where this often would happen in India, this would happen to someone, and his friends would understand this is fine. They'd keep him, comfortable and quiet, and then he would, after a few days, come back, and if he'd been a shoemaker, he'd be a shoemaker. That's like starting a new religion, but it's like a rebirth almost, and you hear that metaphor, born again and so forth. Well, I think this experience goes across every society in the world and has different names for it and whatnot. And whether you see it as a religious experience or something else, it's a very positive thing for people to experience.
In the decades that followed, in addition to probability and decision analysis, you began researching and teaching classes in ethics and also liberty.
Right.
How do these apparently disparate fields relate to each other?
Well, you see, ethics has to do with this. I mentioned this a little earlier. The part of your personal ethical code, that's what we talk about in the ethics class, that you're willing to impose on other people by force. That's a subset of the code. In other words, if someone came in here now and started to beat up on you, I would have no problem in restraining them and using force against them to keep them from doing that if I possibly could. And that's part of my ethical code. So I have no problem in using force against people who harm other people or steal their property. But I do have a problem with using coercive means, which means either violence or the threat of violence, to get people to do what you want them to do. Okay? If they themselves are being peaceful, that is, not using force or the threat of it, and honest, they're not stealing or defrauding or something like that. In other words, they're not criminals in the everyday common sense law, an everyday common law sense of the word. But we see people being forced to do all kinds of things by governments, like drafted. You've got to go in the army. If you've ever read All Quiet and the Western Front, and this book about World War I, where the French soldier and the German soldier are trying to kill each other, and then one of them looks in the wall to the other and sees the pictures of that guy's wife and child. What are we doing here? Why was this? Whatever led us to be killing someone? For me to be killing someone that I really have no argument with, and I've deprived him of his life and his family of him. I remember there was a movie called The Kite Runner a few years back, and there was a statement in there that the ultimate crime is theft. Because if you kill someone, you steal him from his family. In other words, you've deprived his family of that. And if you're lying, you've deprived the person you're talking of the truth. So, in a sense, it's the ultimate moral point. Don't deprive people of things, and that's why the peaceful, honest people should be left alone.
So the ethics part and the liberty part
They come together.
They really come together, right. And then decision analysis is the part, as I understand, that gives people a choice within hopefully a broader ethical.
Yes, as a matter of fact, there's
and
two
they'll have the liberty to make choices.
Yeah,
right?
and it's exactly. If you no choice, well, there are people in concentration camps. They still had decisions to make, and the idea was your ultimate freedom is your ability to react in any way you choose to a given situation. So if the Gestapo come in to arrest you, you have some choices. You can fall on your knees and beg them not to. You can punch them in the nose. And these will all have different. But that's the freedom you've got within that system. And ultimately, there's an old saying: you can't put a Buddha in jail. You can put his body in jail, but you can't put his mind in jail. So that's the ultimate freedom. Okay. But on the other hand, a lot of mischief goes on in the world by people pushing other people around. And I don't know what day this will ever be seen, but I guarantee people will be killing each other in the world in massive ways. It's been true for decades in my life, that some group's been killing another group for very good reasons all over the world.
Ron, switching gears a little bit, you have always encouraged your students and colleagues to complement theory with practice.
Absolutely.
And you yourself have always engaged in consulting as well as your academic pursuits throughout your career. Why so?
Well, basically, I'm an engineer, okay? And I guess if I were a mathematician, theory would be enough. But I want to see an effect of my thoughts in the world. And to do, if you're going to be a decision analyst, you better be dealing with real decisions and not talking about it. If you can't do it on your own stuff, then how can you help somebody else? So and it's not that we're pulling out our tools, we decision analysts, every time we have to order a pizza. That would be a waste of time. But if you have a really challenging decision about your health or about the health of your family or a major investment that'll have long implications for you, well, why wouldn't you use the best tools you have?
So also in the teaching and practice of decision analysis, you've routinely gone well beyond what I would call simple applications of decision theory to what might be called systems engineering with a sound underlying decision-based philosophy. Right. Why have you undertaken to broaden the field of decision theory to include the systems engineering perspective?
Well, remember, the whole purpose of being an engineer is to make life better for people. In other words, whether you're Edison, look at the people who invented or discovered and put into practice electric generators, and so it transformed life. And it's not just a theoretical thing. It's great to have physicists may well study things that then give us ideas about what to do, but ultimately engineers are about doing and not just knowing. You have to know and do. And it's interesting, MIT's motto was mens et manus, mind and hand. Okay? In other words, it's not enough just to think it. You got to do something. And the MIT motto, in fact, not the MIT's mascot, which is on the ring, is a beaver. Because the beaver's out there doing. He's building dams and so on, right? He's not just observing nature. He's doing something about it.
So along the way, you've been associated with several historic organizations and operations research. We've already talked about a bit about MIT, A.D. Little, your early associations with Stanford and Bill Linville, and even SRI.
Yeah.
What about your later work with the Strategic Decisions Group in particular, or anyone else that kind of led up to that? Can you comment on the highlights of your involvement with such organizations?
Well, what has happened is that over the years, I think now I've had some 90 doctoral students at MIT and Stanford. Many of them have gone on to, some have gone from academia, but many have gone on to start in businesses and work in business and help other people. And actually, one business often leads to another business. So there's at least one business that was a split off from SRI, the Decision Analysis Group, which was the founding, the hotbed of this originally. Some people who had worked there started a company from my doctoral students, and then that company was taken over by some other of my doctoral students in the second birth. And you know, I haven't drawn the whole map of this yet, but it's amazing how many the fields from the care for people who have addictive problems, doing systems for that, to all kinds of operations management problems, to investment. The students have been wonderful. They've created all kinds of value for people around the world, not just in the U.S. Come from every continent except Antarctica. I guess we're kind of short on Antarctic students.
So with these various consulting organizations, your longest tenure, I think by far, has been with Strategic Decisions Group. It's been over 30 years.
Yes, well, I'm still associated with them, but now the association is not so much. I'm not an owner or anything like that of Strategic Decisions Group now, but we do have a joint activity in this the Stanford Center for Professional Development, running a course called, or a series of courses, a certificate programs called Strategic Decision and Risk Management. So the SDG is the quote company that will do this as a business. And then I'm the academic director of this program, and the idea is the students that we get, and there's hundreds every year, are going to be also learning not just the practical side of it, but also the best thing we can learn from our vantage point as a research university. So it's a nice combination of theory and practice again.
Yeah. Looking back over your association with these various consulting organizations, have there been significant evolutions of thought that you've noticed, or very large changes in practice that are notable from your perspective?
Well, one of the big questions is who is responsible for, I should back up for decision analysis again. You need, for any decision, the fundamentals are you need to think about your alternatives, how those alternatives will result in what happens in the future, the outcomes, and they may be uncertain, and finally your preferences. And for an individual, we can someone facing a decision, we can pretty much think all of that through. But you see, part of the process is not just dealing with your present information. One of the main contributions of decision analysis is to figure out what information would be worth acquiring to help you make a better decision, right down to what would you be willing to pay for it. And so it's not we're just taking the problem as given. We can now talk about, well, what would a new alternative would be worth? What would new information be worth? Are you sure about your preferences? Let's look at the choices you're really making. So there's a kind of not just taking it as given, but the whole process of making sure you have accurately represented these things and helped the person or company do as much as they can. And that's what's evolved, being better and better on the consulting side to make sure that this is really delivering all the benefit to that person. And that benefit can be dollars if it's a company, and it can be better chances of better health if it's a medical decision.
Looking back over the last 50 years, In what ways has decision analysis either exceeded or fallen short of your hopes and expectations?
Well, I guess I'm not a big believer in expectations. That's, you're bound to be disappointed if you're talking about expectations. I think you want to live in maybe expectancy, but not expectations. You want good things to happen, but you also want to accept what happens. Because believe me, in any person's life, it will not all be good. And as a matter of fact, let's take the idea of love. Right? As soon as you decide to love somebody, you're signing up for the pain of loss if something happens to them. So one alternative, don't love anybody. Not a good alternative. But realize that it's not necessarily going to be the wonderful thing you thought it would be. Because anytime you love, you can lose. And of course, there's this old saying, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Maybe that was set up to be, if you have a breakup with your loved one. But just think about including the death of this person you promised to be with till death do you part. It's in there too.
Then what would be your expectancy or aspirations for the future of decision analysis?
Well, when you talk about decision analysis, I really want to talk about decision making, which gets us into the whole ethics and coercion side of things. So for decision analysis itself, I would like everybody in the world to be able to have the access to this way of thinking that will make their lives much more satisfying by realizing that they have choices about what they do, number one, and that they shouldn't beat up on themselves if they made a good decision and it didn't work out the way they thought it would. In other words, the keystone of decision analysis is realizing that you can't tell the quality of the decision by the quality of the outcome that it produced. And if you make a bad decision with a good outcome, like driving drunk and killing somebody, right? That's a really bad decision with a bad outcome. But it's also a bad decision if you don't kill somebody, if you drive drunk.
Yes. Ron, looking back over your career, of what do you feel most proud of having contributed or accomplished?
Well, you said about what I did. I'm blessed. It's not what I did, it's what I got. What I got was all these wonderful people who have been colleagues and friends. But it's really great to see someone after 20 years or 30 years, and it may be that long sometimes, and be able almost to pick up where you left off. I mean, the same language, and they'll tell, I've never had anybody say, you really pulled the wool over my eyes with this decision analysis stuff. I've been waiting to tell you, it's all BS. Never happened. As a matter of fact, I get quite the contrary comment, and that's terrific. Because I don't want to spread a virus, I want to spread a really good idea.
Well, I think many would agree that you have done so, you and your colleagues. Ron, over your career, you've emphasized and thought very, very carefully about decisions. Why is it that decisions are so important and such a worthy focus?
Well, when you think about it, decisions are the only things you can do that change the future, change your future, the rest of your life. Bad things can happen to you that out of the blue, you could be hit by cars, you cross the street. Good things could happen to you. You might win a prize of some kind. But the only thing you can do to change your future is the decisions you make. And that's true for everybody in the world. So that's why it's such a keen focus in your life. You have to say, okay, anything I do that I choose to do may have long-lasting implications for me. And there's another thing along these lines that's worth thinking about, because we talked about good decisions and bad decisions. Good decisions never become bad, and bad decisions never become good. It also means there's no point for regret if you make good decisions. And in the early days, there was a case when the polio vaccine was invented, and some parents, of course all parents were very much frightened of their children getting polio. Well, some parents hurried out to do that, and it turned out that batch of vaccine was defective. And so their children got polio because their parents gave them the vaccine. And psychologists would work with these parents to say, you did nothing wrong. It was not you were being foolhardy. You were making, now we have the term, you were making a good decision that had a bad outcome. So there's no reason for regret or recrimination, because if you took your kids for a ride in the country and a truck ran into them, you wouldn't say you should never take your kids for a ride in the country, right?
Right.
Bad things can happen, and they do, but that doesn't mean you don't make a good decision about what to do. In other words, take them to ride in the country, put them in their seat belts, have a car that's properly maintained and all of that, but don't be afraid of living life to the full if you're being prudent, and you don't know whether you're being prudent until you use the decision focus. If you're being prudent, living it. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Done.
Very powerful.
Food for
clear
thought.
Perspective, right? Food for thought. Thank you. Ron, looking back over your career, how would you most like to be remembered?
Okay, fondly. I'd like to be remembered fondly. What else could you wish for? Right?
I think you will be remembered fondly, speaking from my heart, and the hundreds and hundreds of people that have had the chance to work with you over the years.
Well, thank you, Tom, and believe me, the feeling is mutual.
And thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you.